Let us all pray for my daughter Clara, 33 years old with no career to speak of, and still not a single man wants her. It is pathetic, really. My mother Beatrice announced this into a microphone while the spotlight illuminated her face. 150 elite guests erupted into laughter. I did not flinch. I simply took another bite of my expensive wagyu steak, wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, and smiled. I adjusted the simple metallic bracelet on my wrist and stood up. "Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "The man you have been waiting for is already here." The heavy mahogany ballroom doors swung open, and my mother dropped the microphone in absolute shock when she saw who walked in. My name is Clara, and at 33 years old, I finally learned how to destroy the toxic family empire that had suffocated me my entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to sit quietly while toxic family members underestimated exactly who you are and what you are capable of building. Growing up in a wealthy Connecticut suburb, my family was obsessed with image and social standing. My mother Beatrice was a ruthless socialite who measured human worth entirely by net worth and country club memberships. My older brother Evan was her golden child. He was handed the keys to the family business Wilson Corporation, which was a legacy real estate and development firm, despite having zero actual business acumen. For years, they treated me like the ultimate family embarrassment. I was the quiet daughter, the one who moved to New York City and supposedly struggled to make ends meet in a tiny apartment. They assumed my lack of flashy designer labels and my absence from their elite social circles meant I was failing at life. They had absolutely no idea that I was the chief executive officer of Aegis Capital, a ruthless and highly successful hedge fund. And they certainly did not know that as of 9 o'clock that very morning, my firm had purchased 60% of their company U.S. bad debt. The setting for my final family gathering was a sprawling $20 million beachfront estate in the Hamptons. Evan was marrying Jada, an incredibly brilliant and fiercely ambitious African-American corporate lawyer. I actually respected Jada from a distance. She was pragmatic, sharp, and knew exactly how to navigate the corporate world. But she had been completely blinded by Evan's supposed wealth and the prestige of the Wilson family name. She chose to align herself with my mother, believing it would secure her position in high society and guarantee a life of luxury. She had no idea she was marrying a man who had secretly drained his company U.S. employee pension funds just to buy her a 4-carat diamond ring and pay for this ridiculous party. Despite being the groom's biological sister, I was deliberately seated at table 24. It was a tiny, wobbly table tucked right next to the swinging kitchen doors, catching a cold draft every time the catering staff rushed past with heavy trays. I was seated with distant cousins and a few very awkward plus ones who did not know anyone else in the room. It was a highly calculated move by Beatrice to show me exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. But I honestly did not care. I sat there in my simple 3-year-old navy blue silk dress, quietly analyzing the room and running the numbers in my head. I knew exactly how much this wedding cost. The floral arrangements alone were $50,000. The catering was easily another 100,000. All of it paid for with stolen money that Evan did not actually have. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses signaled it was time for the evening toasts. Beatrice glided to the center of the ballroom stage looking radiant in a custom silver gown. She took the microphone, thanking the wealthy investors, the local politicians, and the socialites who had gathered to celebrate her perfect son. She praised Evan endlessly, calling him a visionary leader and the ultimate savior of the Wilson family legacy. She complimented Jada on her beauty and intelligence, welcoming her into their elite world. And then her eyes locked onto me, sitting in the dark shadows by the kitchen doors. Her smile turned sharp and predatory. She took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. "And before we raise our glasses to the happy couple," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "I think we should take a brief moment of silence for my daughter Clara. She is sitting way in the back there. Let us all pray for her. 33 years old, no career, no ambition, and still no man wants her. It is truly pathetic to watch her sit there and eat food paid for by her brother, us hard work. The ballroom fell dead silent for a fraction of a second before a ripple of cruel laughter washed over the wealthy crowd. 150 pairs of eyes turned to look at the pathetic spinster in the back of the room. I felt the intense heat of their stares, but my heart rate did not even spike. Years of surviving my mother-us emotional abuse had forged my patience into absolute steel. I picked up my heavy silver steak knife. I smoothly sliced a piece of the $200 steak, brought it to my lips, and chewed it thoughtfully. I did not cry. I did not run out of the room in shame. I maintained perfect, unwavering eye contact with my mother as I swallowed my food. My cold and calculated demeanor seemed to unnerve her just a fraction, causing her triumphant smirk to falter for a microsecond. Evan, emboldened by the laughter of his friends and the champagne flowing through his veins, walked over to my table. He leaned down, placing his hands heavily on my table with his expensive cologne, overwhelming my senses. "Enjoying the steak, Clara," he whispered loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear clearly. "Try not to choke on it. It is the most expensive meal you will eat all year. You should be thanking me on your knees for even letting you into this venue today." I blotted my lips with my white linen napkin and looked up at my older brother. I noticed the heavy sweat beading on his forehead, a physical sign of the immense financial stress he was desperately trying to hide from his new bride and our mother. I smiled a genuine and terrifying smile. "Oh, Evan," I said softly, "I am enjoying every single bite. But you should be the one praying right now, because the tab for this little party is about to come due." I checked the time. It was exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. I stood up, pushing my chair back and smoothing the skirt of my dress. I looked across the room at Beatrice, who was still holding the microphone, looking incredibly annoyed that I had not broken down in tears. I raised my voice just enough to carry over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "Mom," I called out, ensuring every guest could hear me. "You said no man wants me. But the man you have been begging to secure an investment meeting with for the last 2 years is pulling up to the driveway right now, and he is here for me." At that exact moment, the heavy double doors of the ballroom were pushed open by two large security guards. Standing in the entryway was Alexander Thorne, the 35-year-old tech billionaire and the most elusive investor in New York City. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Alexander Thorne did not attend social events. He did not accept wedding invitations. Yet here he was, stepping onto the plush carpet of the Hamptons estate. His silent presence commanded absolute authority. Evan stood beside my cramped table and let out a heavy breath he had been holding. His panicked sweat transformed into a look of arrogant triumph. He genuinely believed his desperate emails had finally worked. Evan leaned down and gripped my shoulder with enough force to leave a bruise. He smirked as his hot breath hit my ear. "You see that, Clara? That is what a real chief executive commands. I have spent the last 3 years turning Wilson Corporation into an untouchable real estate empire. Now the biggest fish in the ocean has come to pay his respects to me." He patted my shoulder in a condescending rhythm. "Watch and learn how actual power operates, little sister. Maybe if you paid attention instead of being a financial parasite draining our family name, you would not be sitting by the kitchen doors." Across the room, I caught the eye of Jada. As a top-tier corporate lawyer, she knew the ruthless reputation of Alexander Thorne. She looked stunning in her designer wedding gown, with her dark skin glowing under the crystal chandeliers. However, her stiff posture betrayed a slight but noticeable discomfort. She had heard the cruel laughter of the 150 elite guests moments earlier, when my mother publicly humiliated me. I saw the hesitation in her eyes and the brief flash of empathy for another woman being torn down in public. But Jada remained perfectly silent. She adjusted her grip on her champagne flute and averted her gaze. She chose her new husband and the prestige of the Wilson family over basic human decency. She had married into this toxic dynasty for the high status it promised. She truly believed Evan was the brilliant heir to a highly successful conglomerate. She was about to learn exactly how fragile that illusion truly was. The guests, recovering from the initial shock of the arrival, began to whisper excitedly. The cruel laughter directed at me seamlessly transitioned into an echo chamber of sycophantic murmurs praising Evan. I could hear snippets of their conversations floating over the string quartet, which had completely stopped playing music. They marveled at the supposed business acumen of my brother. They whispered about how he had revitalized Wilson Corporation. They praised my mother Beatrice for securing such a high-profile connection. Not a single person in that room questioned the false narrative my family had spent years carefully constructing. To them, I was exactly what my mother had proclaimed. A pathetic 33-year-old spinster who contributed nothing to society. Meanwhile, my brother was a visionary titan of modern industry. Evan straightened his tailored tuxedo jacket and shot me one final look of utter disgust. "Stay out of the way, Clara," he ordered with his voice laced with venom. "Do not ruin this night for me. I need to secure this partnership to expand our commercial division into Manhattan. If you embarrass me in front of Thorne, I swear I will make sure Mother cuts off whatever meager allowance you think you are entitled to receive." I did not react to his hollow threat. I simply reached for my water glass and took a slow, measured sip. The sheer audacity of his delusion was almost fascinating to witness. He truly believed he was the ultimate mastermind behind the operations of Wilson Corporation. He had spent the last 18 months sitting in a corner office playing golf on Tuesdays. He was funneling the operational budget into offshore accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle and purchase the massive diamond engagement ring for Jada. He thought he was completely untouchable. He thought I was just a bitter college dropout, living in a cramped city apartment and surviving on the leftover generosity of our family. He had no idea that the meager allowance he referenced was actually a clever cover for my own massive independent wealth. He had no idea that I had spent the last decade building Aegis Capital from the ground up. I turned it into a highly successful financial juggernaut that specialized in acquiring and dismantling failing companies. Companies exactly like Wilson Corporation. Alexander Thorne began to walk down the center aisle of the ballroom. His security detail moved with quiet efficiency to create a clear path through the sea of wealthy guests who were falling over themselves to get his attention. Men in expensive suits extended their hands hoping for a mere handshake. Women wearing diamonds offered brilliant, desperate smiles. Alexander completely ignored every single one of them. His gaze was fixed dead ahead. He scanned the room with the precise, calculating look of a predator entering new territory. Evan puffed out his chest and stepped away from my table, leaving me in the shadows. He plastered on his charismatic deal-making smile and strode confidently toward the center of the room to intercept the billionaire. He shot a quick, triumphant glance at Jada, who offered him a supportive nod. Her earlier discomfort was completely masked by her professional poise. My mother Beatrice practically vibrated with excitement on the stage. Her cruel humiliation of me was forgotten in the face of this monumental social victory. She was already planning her next country club anecdote. They all stood there bathing in the glow of their fabricated superiority. They were convinced that this moment would cement their legacy forever. They were oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended directly above their heads. I remained seated at table 24 with my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched the spectacle unfold with cold anticipation. The echo chamber of their cruelty was about to shatter into jagged pieces. I was going to immensely enjoy every single beautiful second of the deafening silence that would naturally follow. Alexander continued his slow, methodical advance across the pristine marble floor of the ballroom. The string quartet remained completely silent, leaving only the sound of his measured footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceilings. The wealthy guests, who had just been laughing at my expense, were now holding their breath. They parted like the Red Sea, shuffling backward in their expensive gowns and tailored suits to give the billionaire a wide berth. Evan was still striding forward with his hand outstretched, a picture of unearned confidence. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. He was ready to pitch his company as the investment opportunity of a lifetime. He believed his superficial charm could win over a man who ruthlessly dismantled tech empires before breakfast. I watched my brother close the distance, his smile stretching wider with every step. Mr. Thorne Evan called out, his voice booming with false camaraderie. "Welcome to my wedding. It is an absolute honor to have you here tonight. We have so much to discuss regarding the future of our commercial division." Evan thrust his hand forward, expecting a firm handshake that would signal a new era of wealth for our family. Alexander did not even break his stride. He did not blink. He did not look at Evan. He walked right past my brother, leaving him standing awkwardly in the middle of the aisle with his hand extended to empty air. The two massive security guards flanking Alexander bumped Evan's shoulder hard enough to make him stumble backward. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Evan's face turned a violent shade of crimson. His humiliation was instantaneous and entirely public. Jada watched from the head table, her sharp legal mind immediately analyzing the sudden shift in the power dynamic. She recognized a deliberate snub when she saw one. On the stage, my mother Beatrice clutched the microphone with white knuckles. Her grand social victory was unraveling before her eyes. She had spent 2 grueling years begging Alexander office for a mere 5-minute phone call. She had sent lavish gifts, leveraged every country club connection, and dropped his name at every charity gala, hoping to fabricate a relationship that did not exist. She needed his money to save the crumbling foundation of our family business. Seeing him ignore her golden child sent a visible shockwave through her perfectly manicured exterior. She forced a bright, desperate smile and stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "Mr. Thorne," she projected through the microphone, her voice trembling slightly, "we are so delighted you could join our family celebration. Please come up to the main table." Alexander stopped in his tracks, but he did not look at the stage. He stood perfectly still in the center of the ballroom. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the heavy, oppressive quiet of 150 powerful people realizing they were entirely powerless. This was my cue. I placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. The movement drew the eyes of the guests nearest to me, who looked confused as to why the pathetic sister was moving at all. I reached across with my right hand and slowly adjusted the simple metallic bracelet on my left wrist. It clicked into place with a faint metallic sound that felt incredibly loud in the dead quiet room. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my simple navy blue dress. I did not look at Evan, who was still recovering from his public rejection. I did not look at Jada. I looked directly at the stage. "Mom," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. I did not need a microphone to be heard. The acoustics of the massive room carried my words perfectly to every single guest. "You have spent this entire evening telling these people that no one wants me. You have prayed for my pathetic life and laughed at my supposed failures. But you should probably look closely at the center of the room." I smiled, a calm, chilling smile that finally caused the color to completely drain from my mother's face. "Because the man you have been waiting for, the man you have been begging to save your precious company, he is already here. And he certainly did not come to celebrate Evan." Alexander finally turned his head. He did not look at the stage where Beatrice was frozen in horror. He did not look at the lavish wedding cake or the beautiful bride. He turned and looked directly at me, standing by the swinging kitchen doors at table 24. The guests followed his gaze, their heads swiveling back and forth between the untouchable tech billionaire and the family outcast. The confusion on their faces was absolutely delicious. They were trying to calculate the impossible mathematics of this situation. How could Alexander Thorne, the most powerful investor in New York City, have any connection to the woman who was just publicly mocked by her own mother? The cognitive dissonance was breaking their carefully constructed social rules. Whispers began to break out like a sudden rustling of dry leaves. People were leaning into each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Did she just say he came for her?" someone murmured from a nearby table. "That is impossible," another replied. "She works in a tiny office. She is a nobody." But the physical evidence in front of them contradicted their gossip. Alexander was standing perfectly still, facing me with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of utmost respect. He was waiting for my instruction. The security guards who had effortlessly shoved my brother aside were now standing at attention, mirroring their boss deference to me. The power in the room had physically shifted, gathering like a storm cloud right above my drafty little table in the back. My time had finally arrived. The ultimate reckoning was here. It was glorious. The heavy microphone slipped from my mother's fingers and clattered onto the wooden stage. The harsh electronic feedback shrieked through the speakers, causing several guests to cover their ears. But the sharp noise barely registered against the absolute shock paralyzing the room. The transition from cruel amusement to bewildered silence was instantaneous. Beatrice stood frozen with her perfectly styled hair catching the spotlight and her mouth slightly open. The smug satisfaction that had defined her features just moments ago vanished completely. Evan recovered first. Driven by sheer desperation and the crushing weight of the company's hidden debt, he saw an opportunity he could not afford to miss. The man who held the power to save him from financial ruin and probable prison time was standing right in his reception hall. Evan practically sprinted down the aisle, abandoning his new bride at the head table. His face was flushed with frantic energy. He smoothed his tie and plastered on his most charming business smile, the one he reserved for wealthy clients and gullible investors. "Mr. Thorne?" Evan called out again, his voice pitched slightly too high. "It is truly an honor. I am Evan Wilson, the CEO of Wilson Corporation. I have been trying to coordinate a meeting with your acquisitions team for months." He reached out both hands, eager to grasp Alexander's hand and pull him into a firm, dominant handshake. Evan was completely oblivious to the fact that Alexander was not looking at him. Alexander was still looking directly at me, sitting quietly at the worst table in the room. Before Evan could take another step, the two massive security guards flanking Alexander moved with startling speed. They stepped smoothly in front of the billionaire, forming an impenetrable human wall. The guard on the left raised a large hand, pressing it firmly against Evan's chest. He did not shove my brother, but the implied threat of force was unmistakable. "Sir, please step back." The guard stated, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. "You are too close." Evan stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. His charismatic smile shattered, replaced by a look of profound indignation. "I am the groom." Evan sputtered loudly, looking around to ensure the guests were witnessing this perceived insult. "This is my wedding. I am the host of this event. Do you have any idea who I am?" The security guards remained impassive, completely unmoved by his outburst. Alexander did not even blink. He continued to stand in silence, his presence alone dominating the massive ballroom. By this time, my mother had recovered her senses. She scrambled down the steps of the stage, her silver gown rustling loudly. She pushed past a group of startled guests, her eyes locked onto Alexander. She saw her golden child being rebuffed and her maternal instincts tangled with her desperate ambition. She needed Alexander Thorne to validate her family's status. She needed his money to keep up her elaborate charade of wealth. "Alexander," she cried out, using his first name with unearned familiarity. "Please forgive the interruption. We are just so thrilled you decided to grace us with your presence. I am Beatrice Wilson, Evan's mother. We have spoken to your office numerous times." She attempted to maneuver around the security guards, extending her hand with a practiced, elegant gesture. The guard on the right mirrored his partner's movement, smoothly blocking her path. "Ma'am, please maintain your distance," he commanded firmly. Beatrice recoiled as if she had been physically struck. The rejection was palpable and deeply humiliating. 150 of her closest friends, competitors, and social rivals were watching her being treated like a common nuisance at her own son's wedding. Her carefully constructed image of power and influence was disintegrating under the cold, indifferent gaze of a man she desperately wanted to impress. The sheer embarrassment overwhelmed her capacity for rational thought. She needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame for this public indignity. And as always, she chose me. She spun around, her eyes searching the shadows near the kitchen doors, until she found me sitting calmly at my table. Her face contorted with a sudden violent rage. The elegant socialite vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate woman lashing out at the easiest target. "Clara!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. What is the meaning of this? Did you plan this little stunt? Did you actually hire these men to come here and ruin your brother's wedding? The accusation hung in the air, heavy and absurd. The guests murmured among themselves, their confusion deepening. They looked from the imposing billionaire to my furious mother and finally to me sitting alone in my simple navy dress. The idea that I could hire Alexander Thorne, one of the wealthiest men in the country, to act as a prop in a family dispute was ludicrous. But Beatrice was beyond logic. She was operating entirely on panic. "You are sick, Clara." My mother continued marching toward my table, her finger pointing accusingly. "You have always been jealous of Evan. You have always been bitter about his success. To hire actors to storm in here and disrupt his special day. You are a psycho. This is exactly why you have no friends and no career. You are a pathetic, vindictive spinster." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I sat perfectly still, allowing her toxic words to wash over me. I watched her unspool her desperate lies, laying bare the depth of her delusion. She was trying to gaslight an entire room of people, attempting to rewrite the reality, unfolding right before their eyes. She needed them to believe I was crazy, so she would not have to confront the terrifying possibility that I was actually powerful. I looked past my mother's furious red face and met Alexander's eyes again. He had witnessed the entire exchange. He had heard every cruel word she had spoken. I saw a slight tightening of his jaw, a subtle shift in his expression that indicated he was ready to intervene. I slowly raised my hand, placing one finger gently against my lips. It was a silent command to hold his position. I wanted her to keep talking. I wanted everyone in that room to hear exactly who she was. The longer she spun her web of lies, the harder she would fall when the truth finally shattered it. My mother continued to rant, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom as she hurled wild accusations in my direction. She painted a picture of a jealous sister staging an elaborate prank to steal the spotlight from her golden child. She demanded that security remove the intruders immediately, but her words fell on deaf ears. Alexander Thorne did not even glance in her direction. He acted as if Beatrice Wilson was nothing more than a mild gust of wind rustling the curtains. With a subtle flick of his wrist, he signaled his massive bodyguards to step aside. The two imposing men immediately parted, creating a clear and unobstructed path down the remainder of the center aisle. Alexander stepped forward, leaving my mother sputtering in mid-sentence. He walked past the towering floral arrangements and the crystal centerpieces that adorned the pristine tables of the elite guests. He bypassed the weeping ice sculpture and the towering champagne fountain. His focus remained entirely singular. He was heading straight toward the swinging kitchen doors where Table 24 sat in the drafty shadows. The rhythmic tapping of his polished leather shoes against the marble floor served as the only soundtrack in the vast, cavernous room. The wealthy investors, socialites, and politicians watched his progression with a mixture of absolute horror and morbid fascination. They saw a man whose net worth rivaled the gross domestic product of small nations, deliberately ignoring the host of the event, to approach the woman who had just been publicly declared a pathetic failure. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. The air in the room grew incredibly thick, heavy with the unspoken realization that the social hierarchy they all worshipped was currently being dismantled right before their very eyes. My brother Evan stood frozen near the head table, his face a mask of profound confusion. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. He watched the billionaire stride past him without a second glance. The rejection was absolute and devastating. At the head table, Jada leaned forward slightly, her sharp legal mind processing the unprecedented scene. She observed the rigid posture of the billionaire and the calm, composed demeanor of the woman sitting by the kitchen doors. She recognized that true power did not need to shout through a microphone. True power simply commanded the room by existing within it. Alexander finally reached my small, wobbly table. He stood towering over me, his presence casting a long shadow across the white linen tablecloth. Up close, he was even more intimidating than his reputation suggested. His tailored suit fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and his sharp, intelligent eyes reflected a mind that processed information at terrifying speeds. He had built his technology empire by destroying inefficiencies and crushing competitors. He was a man who yielded to absolutely no one. He looked down at me sitting in my simple 3-year-old navy blue dress, holding my steady gaze. He took a deep breath, preparing to speak. He opened his mouth, ready to deliver the words that would officially seal the fate of the Wilson Corporation and confirm my true identity to the bewildered crowd. But I was not ready for him to speak. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. I needed the tension to stretch just a little bit further. I needed my family to fully absorb the reality of their impending downfall before the final blow was struck. I slowly lifted my right hand, resting my elbow on the edge of the table. I extended a single index finger, holding it up in the space between us. "Wait right there," I commanded. My voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but the absolute authority woven into that single syllable carried a weight that struck the room like a physical blow. It was not a request. It was an undeniable directive issued from a superior to a subordinate. I did not break eye contact with him. I simply held my finger in the air, demanding his total compliance. The ballroom seemingly stopped rotating on its axis. 150 elite guests gasped in unison, a collective sharp intake of breath that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the massive space. The sound was incredibly loud, a visceral reaction to the impossible scene unfolding before them. A woman universally declared a useless spinster had just ordered a notoriously ruthless billionaire to halt. And the most shocking part was not my command. The most shocking part was his immediate reaction. Alexander Thorne snapped his mouth shut. He did not frown. He did not display anger or indignity at being silenced by a woman sitting by the kitchen doors. Instead, he bowed his head just a fraction of an inch, acknowledging my authority. He lowered his hands, clasping them respectfully in front of him. He obediently stopped moving and stood before me in perfect and absolute frozen silence. He waited for my permission to speak. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently that it caused a metaphorical whiplash. The illusion of the Wilson family's superiority shattered into a million jagged pieces upon the marble floor. My mother Beatrice let out a strangled whimper from the stage, her hands flying to cover her mouth. The undeniable visual evidence of my absolute supremacy completely broke her fragile socialite mind. She had spent 3 decades meticulously crafting a false narrative of my inferiority to elevate her own status among these wealthy peers. Now that entire fictional universe was imploding rapidly, leaving her exposed and entirely defenseless. Evan tightly gripped the polished edge of a nearby chair, his knuckles turning stark white as his trembling legs threatened to give out completely. They finally understood the horrifying truth that I was not a weak pawn in their cruel game. I was the supreme architect of their absolute destruction, and I held their entire crumbling world firmly in the palm of my raised hand while they helplessly watched in pure, unadulterated terror. The stifling silence that blanketed the ballroom was suddenly broken by the sharp, rhythmic sound of heels striking the marble floor. Jada could no longer remain a passive observer to the absolute social devastation dismantling her new family. As a successful corporate attorney, she was trained to thrive in moments of intense conflict and to assert dominance. She rose from the head table, smoothing the voluminous layers of her exquisite white designer wedding gown. She carried herself with the formidable grace and unyielding confidence that had made her one of the most feared and respected legal minds in the city. Her dark skin glowed beautifully under the crystal chandeliers, but her sharp eyes narrowed with fierce determination. She had worked incredibly hard to secure her position in high society, and she was not about to let a bitter outcast ruin the most important day of her life. Jada walked directly toward my table, deliberately placing herself between my brother Evan and the terrifying presence of the billionaire. She viewed Alexander as a trespasser, and me as a nuisance that needed to be eradicated. Jada stopped right in front of my small table, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked down at me with professional disdain. "Clara," she began, her voice projecting crisp authority across the room. I have remained silent out of respect for your mother and pity for your distress. But this absurd theatrical display ends right this second. You are intentionally inflicting emotional distress upon the groom, and you are creating a public nuisance that violates the basic codes of civil conduct. You have disrupted a private celebration and caused tortious interference with a sensitive business networking opportunity. Her legal jargon flowed effortlessly, designed to intimidate anyone who lacked a sophisticated understanding of corporate law. She was attempting to establish a verbal perimeter of defense around Evan, hoping to shield his bruised ego from any further public humiliation. She thought her highly aggressive legal terminology would force me to cower and retreat back into the shadows. I did not break my posture. I kept my hand raised high, holding Alexander in his frozen state of compliance, while I shifted my gaze to meet the fierce, challenging stare of my brother's new wife. Jada took a deep breath, puffing out her chest to maximize her physical presence in the tense space. "I am officially acting as legal counsel for my husband," she declared, her tone laced with absolute certainty. "If you and your highly disruptive friend do not vacate these premises immediately, I will have the local authorities dispatched to this location. I will personally ensure that you are both arrested and charged with criminal trespassing and disturbing the peace." She gestured broadly around the massive ballroom encompassing the towering floral arrangements and the expansive windows that looked out over the private beach. "Evan owns this entire estate, Clara. This property is his exclusive domain. He holds the deed, and he possesses the absolute legal right to revoke your implicit invitation to this venue. You are officially trespassing on private property, and your presence is no longer legally tolerated by the rightful owner." She delivered the threat with the polished precision of a seasoned litigator delivering a closing argument. She expected me to panic. She expected me to apologize and flee through the kitchen doors to avoid the impending embarrassment of a police escort. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound of my amusement rippled through the tense air, causing Jada to falter for the very first time. I slowly lowered my hand, releasing Alexander from his mandated stillness, though he wisely remained exactly where he stood. I looked at Jada and smiled a warm, almost pitying smile. I harbored no actual hatred for this woman. In fact, I deeply respected her formidable intellect and her impressive career trajectory. She had fought her way to the top of a ruthless corporate ladder, using nothing but her own brilliant mind and relentless work ethic. She was sharp, analytical, and fiercely protective of the life she was building. But her fatal flaw was the blind spot she had developed regarding the man she had chosen to marry. She was so captivated by the illustrious history of the Wilson family name that she had failed to conduct basic due diligence on the man standing beside her. She had completely bought into the fabricated illusion of his immense wealth and visionary leadership. She genuinely believed that Evan owned the magnificent, expensive private estate surrounding us today. She truly believed that the diamond resting heavily on her ring finger was a symbol of his vast fortune. She was a brilliant legal strategist who had been entirely conned by a desperate failing man. "Jada," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any fear or intimidation, "I truly admire your dedication to your new husband. Your legal arguments are exceptionally constructed, and your delivery is absolutely flawless. Any opposing counsel would be terrified to face you in a courtroom setting." I picked up my water glass and took a refreshing sip, letting the anticipation build. "But the problem with your brilliant legal threat is that it relies on a foundation of completely fabricated facts." I placed the glass back onto the linen tablecloth and folded my hands in my lap. "You are operating under the assumption that my brother holds the deed to this magnificent property. You are operating under the assumption that he has the financial standing to command an arrest. You are remarkably intelligent, Jada, but you are entirely blind to the reality of the man you just married. You have no idea who he really is or what he has actually done to fund this lavish spectacle." I smiled, watching the slight tremor of doubt crack her perfect professional armor. "Because, my dear Jada, the absolute truth about your husband and the true ownership of this estate is about to hit you harder than any legal sanction could." I maintained my gentle smile as I reached down into the small structured clutch resting beside my plate. My movements were slow and deliberate, contrasting sharply with the frantic energy radiating from my mother and brother. I retrieved my phone, unlocking the screen with a quick tap of my thumb. I opened the secure application that housed the digital records for Aegis Capital and navigated directly to the most recent legal filings. The screen illuminated, displaying a highly sensitive and officially notarized document. With a smooth and practiced motion, I placed the device onto the white linen tablecloth. I applied just enough pressure to slide the phone across the smooth surface. It glided past the crystal water goblet and came to a perfect stop precisely 1 inch from Jada and her manicured hands. Jada looked down at the glowing screen. For a brief second, her fierce posture held strong, but her professional curiosity proved to be far too powerful to resist. She was a corporate attorney, deeply wired to read the fine print and analyze the details before making her next strategic move. She slowly lowered her gaze, allowing her dark eyes to scan the top lines of the digital document. I watched closely as the fundamental reality of her situation began to filter through her brilliant legal mind. The sharp, aggressive edge of her defense attorney persona began to waver, replaced by the cold, calculating comprehension of a woman reading a financial death sentence. Jada. I spoke, letting my voice carry a tone of quiet, professional courtesy. As a highly successful corporate attorney, you should always verify the underlying assets before entering into any binding agreement. You threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on an estate you firmly believe is owned by your new husband. However, if you take a moment to check the public registry, you will discover a completely different narrative. That document you are looking at is the official notice of default. This magnificent beachfront estate went into full legal foreclosure at exactly 9:00 this morning. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Jada stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. She reached out with trembling fingers and picked up my phone. She brought the screen closer to her face, reading the dense legal text with the speed and comprehension only a seasoned lawyer possessed. She saw the official seals, the exact timestamps, and the undeniable names listed on the foreclosure notice. She saw the crushing reality that the man she had just married did not own the ground they were standing on. He did not own the walls surrounding them or the manicured lawns rolling down to the ocean. The entire Wilson family fortune was nothing but smoke and mirrors, built on a foundation of staggering debt and systematic deception. Evan let out a strangled, gasping sound. He lunged forward, reaching blindly for the phone in Jada and her hands. His face, which had previously been flushed with unearned arrogance, completely drained of all color. He turned a sickly, ghostly pale shade that made him look like a cornered animal. Jada, he stammered, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his exposed lies. Do not look at that. It is a fake. She is lying to you. She fabricated that entire document just to ruin our wedding day. She is a bitter, jealous woman trying to destroy my life. Do not listen to a single word she says. Give me the phone right now. But Jada did not hand over the device. She pulled it back out of his desperate reach, her eyes never leaving the illuminated screen. Her legal training allowed her to instantly verify the authenticity of the court filing numbers and the regional jurisdiction codes. She knew a legitimate financial document when she saw one, and she knew Evan was lying to her face. She slowly turned her head to look at the man she had just vowed to spend her life with. The expression on her face transitioned from profound shock to a cold, terrifying realization. She was looking at a stranger. She was looking at a fraud who had used her brilliant career and impeccable reputation to legitimize his own crumbling empire. My mother Beatrice let out a sharp, frantic cry from the stage. She hitched up the skirt of her expensive silver gown and rushed toward us, her heels clicking erratically against the marble floor. Evan, what is she talking about? Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. Tell her to stop this nonsense immediately. We are the Wilson family. We own this estate. We have owned this estate for decades. This is our property. Make her leave before she embarrasses us any further in front of all these important guests. I sat back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of closure. The first domino had finally fallen. The magnificent illusion they had spent years carefully constructing was crashing down around them in a spectacular display of financial ruin. The 150 elite guests who had laughed at me just minutes ago were now whispering frantically among themselves, pulling out their own phones to verify the shocking news. The wealthy investors who had praised Evan and his supposed business acumen were stepping away, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of a massive corporate failure. Alexander Thorne remained standing nearby, a silent and imposing witness to the absolute devastation of the Wilson family legacy. He did not intervene. He simply watched me execute my strategy with flawless precision. He understood the artistry of a hostile takeover, and he recognized that I was currently conducting a masterclass in corporate dismantling. Evan continued to stammer, waving his hands wildly as he tried to construct a believable excuse. He looked at Jada, pleading with his eyes, but he found no sympathy in her cold, calculating stare. He looked at our mother, who was vibrating with pure denial, unable to process the reality of their bankruptcy. And finally, he looked at me. He saw the quiet satisfaction resting in my eyes, and he understood that his reign of arrogant cruelty was permanently over. The reckoning had arrived, and it was absolute. Jada did not blink as her eyes tracked across the glowing screen of my smartphone. The ambient noise of the ballroom faded into a dull hum around her. She was no longer a blushing bride standing at her own lavish wedding reception. She had instantly transitioned back into the formidable corporate litigator who commanded boardrooms across Manhattan. Her highly trained legal mind dissected every single line of the digital document with ruthless efficiency. She examined the official watermarks and the court filing stamps. She verified the parcel numbers that corresponded directly to the magnificent Hamptons estate surrounding us. The documentation was absolutely flawless and entirely indisputable. It detailed a catastrophic series of missed mortgage payments and severely breached financial covenants. But what caught her undivided attention was the name of the primary creditor listed at the very top of the foreclosure notice. It was not a traditional bank or a standard lending institution. The entity that had initiated the hostile takeover of the property was Aegis Capital. I watched the exact moment that specific name registered in her mind. A visible shiver traveled down her spine, causing the delicate lace of her designer gown to tremble slightly. In the high-stakes world of corporate finance, Aegis Capital was a name spoken with a mixture of profound respect and genuine terror. They were widely known as a shadow entity, a highly aggressive hedge fund that specialized in acquiring distressed assets and ruthlessly liquidating them for maximum profit. They did not negotiate. They did not grant extensions. They simply identified failing companies, purchased their bad debt for pennies on the dollar, and dismantled the remaining infrastructure with surgical precision. Jada knew their reputation intimately. She had likely advised her own wealthy clients to avoid crossing paths with them at all costs. Now she was staring at irrefutable proof that this exact apex predator had just swallowed her new husband and his entire family legacy whole. Jada slowly lifted her gaze from the illuminated screen. The warmth and affection she had displayed toward Evan during their vows just hours ago had completely evaporated. She looked at the man sweating profusely in his tailored tuxedo, and she saw him for the very first time. "Evan," she began, her voice dangerously quiet and perfectly measured. "This legal filing states that Aegis Capital acquired the primary debt on this estate 6 months ago. It also outlines a severe default on a corporate bridge loan tied directly to the Wilson Corporation operating accounts." She took a step toward him, her posture rigid. "You told me the company was generating record profits. You told me this estate was fully paid off and held in a generational trust. I need you to explain to me right now why a predatory hedge fund is currently seizing the ground we are standing on." Evan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously above his tight bow tie. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, a desperate attempt to soothe the brilliant lawyer he had foolishly tried to deceive. "Honey, listen to me," he stammered, his voice pitching higher with every word. "It is just a minor clerical error. It is a massive misunderstanding by the accounting department. I have a team of lawyers already handling it. We are just restructuring some temporary liabilities to free up liquid capital for a new commercial expansion. You know how complex these corporate maneuvers can be. That document means nothing. Beatrice stepped forward, her face still flushed with indignation. She placed a manicured hand on Evan's arm, presenting a united front of absolute delusion. Evan is perfectly right, Jada, my mother insisted. You must not let this jealous girl ruin our beautiful evening with her fabricated nonsense. The Wilson family has banking relationships that go back decades. No obscure investment firm is going to take our home. We are completely untouchable. Jada did not even acknowledge my mother. She kept her piercing stare locked onto Evan. You are lying, she stated with absolute finality. Aegis Capital does not make clerical errors. They do not initiate hostile foreclosure proceedings on a whim. If they filed this motion, they already own everything. You are bankrupt, Evan. You have absolutely nothing. Evan opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the room, seeing the wealthy guests whispering and pointing. He saw Alexander Thorne standing silently nearby, a monument to the true wealth Evan had tried so desperately to project. The sheer weight of his prolonged deception was finally crushing the breath out of him. I decided it was time to put him out of his misery. I reached out and gently retrieved my phone from Jada. I tapped the screen once, closing the foreclosure document and locking the device. The soft click of the screen going dark seemed to pull everyone's attention back to my small table by the kitchen doors. I smoothed the napkin in my lap and looked directly at my brother. Jada is completely correct, Evan, I said, my voice carrying a smooth conversational tone that sliced through his panic. Aegis Capital is notoriously precise. We do not make mistakes when we acquire distressed assets. We target companies suffering from gross mismanagement and negligent leadership. Companies that bleed their own pension funds dry just to maintain a pathetic illusion of high society wealth. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. We, she whispered, her eyes darting between me and the phone. What do you mean, we? I smiled brightly, folding my hands perfectly together on the pristine white linen tablecloth. I let the heavy silence stretch for one perfectly calculated second, allowing the tense anticipation to build to a truly unbearable peak. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Capital, I announced clearly and calmly to the entire listening room. And as of 9 o'clock this very morning, I personally own exactly 60% of the Wilson Corporation's toxic bad debt. The sheer impossibility of my statement seemed to short-circuit my mother's brain. Beatrice stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes as the silence in the ballroom stretched into a suffocating eternity. The 150 elite guests remained completely motionless, trapped in the gravitational pull of my revelation. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life curating an image of absolute perfection, my mother simply could not process a reality where her greatest shame was actually her most powerful conqueror. She looked from me to the foreclosure notice still glowing faintly on my phone screen, and then back to my face. The polished veneer of the wealthy socialite finally cracked and broke apart. She let out a harsh, grating laugh that sounded more like a desperate gasp for air. "You are lying!" she spat out, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of fear and furious denial. "You expect us to believe this absolute garbage?" She marched forward, her silver gown catching the light as she pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my chest. Aegis Capital is a massive global hedge fund. It is run by a ruthless financial shark, not a pathetic spinster who lives in a cramped apartment. She turned her head, addressing the crowd of wealthy investors and socialites attempting to rally them to her side. "Look at her," she demanded, gesturing wildly toward me. "Just look at her. She has no makeup on. She is wearing a 3-year-old dress that she probably bought on clearance. Does this look like the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar corporation to any of you? She is nothing but a bitter, jealous failure trying to ruin her brother's perfect day with a fabricated digital document." Evan eagerly latched onto his mother's frantic deflection. The crushing realization of his bankruptcy was momentarily eclipsed by his desperate need to maintain his fragile ego in front of his new wife. "Exactly," Evan shouted, running a hand nervously through his styled hair. "Clara has always been completely unhinged. She knows I have been working tirelessly to secure our new commercial expansion, so she hired some amateur hacker to mock up a fake legal filing. It is a pathetic stunt. Jada, do not listen to a single word she says. We are the Wilson family. We own this estate and our company is stronger than it has ever been." But Jada did not move closer to him. She kept her distance, her sharp legal mind continuing to analyze the situation with cold precision. She was already distancing herself from the sinking ship. I allowed them to shout their desperate delusions. Their loud denials only highlighted their profound ignorance. They measured success by designer labels and country club memberships, entirely oblivious to how real power operated in the modern financial world. True power did not need to shout through a microphone or drape itself in expensive jewelry. True power was quiet, calculating, and absolute. I did not waste my breath arguing with them. I did not raise my voice to defend my wardrobe choices or my lack of cosmetics. I decided to provide the visual evidence that would permanently silence their pathetic protests. I slowly lifted my left hand and rested it on the table. With my right hand, I reached across and touched the simple metallic bracelet that I had been wearing all evening. To my family and the guests, this bracelet looked like a cheap piece of costume jewelry. My mother had actually scoffed at it earlier in the evening, calling it an embarrassment. But it was not jewelry. It was a custom-engineered quantum-encrypted hard drive designed specifically to hold the most sensitive financial data of Aegis Capital. I pressed a hidden mechanism on the underside of the smooth metal band. A faint click echoed in the quiet space. The top section of the bracelet slid back, revealing a small, sophisticated connection port. From my structured clutch resting on the table, I retrieved a sleek, ultra-thin tablet. I placed the tablet flat on the white linen tablecloth right next to my water glass. The guests watched in breathless fascination as I seamlessly unclasped the metallic band from my wrist. I attached the encrypted drive directly into the side port of the tablet. The screen immediately flared to life, casting a sharp blue glow across my face. It did not require a standard password. It required biometric authentication. I placed my thumb against the glass scanner. A soft chime sounded, indicating that the quantum encryption had successfully verified my identity as the chief executive officer. The Aegis Capital corporate logo, a sleek shield design, appeared on the high-definition display, followed instantly by the complete and highly classified financial portfolio of the Wilson Corporation. I turned the tablet around so the glowing screen faced outward toward my mother, my brother, and the surrounding crowd. The display showed real-time data streams representing the massive debts, the hidden offshore transfers, and the total liquidation protocols that I had personally authorized that very morning. The digital ledger provided an undeniable mapped history of Evan's corporate theft and gross negligence. It showed exactly how the employee pension funds had been systematically drained to pay for this very wedding reception. There was no room for denial anymore. The numbers were absolute, and they painted a picture of total, unmitigated ruin. My mother stared at the glowing tablet, her mouth opening and closing silently. The blue light reflected in her wide, terrified eyes. She could not comprehend the complex financial algorithms, but she recognized the official seals and the staggering negative balances attached to her family name. The undeniable truth crashed down upon her, completely crushing her last desperate defense. She could no longer blame my appearance or dismiss my success. The 3-year-old dress and the lack of makeup were irrelevant distractions from the absolute fact that I held their entire existence inside a piece of metal. The glowing screen of the tablet acted as an undeniable beacon of absolute ruin in the dimly lit ballroom. The guests nearest to my table were the first to fully comprehend the devastating reality displayed before them. These were not ordinary spectators. They were seasoned venture capitalists, prominent state politicians, and cutthroat socialites who built their own empires by recognizing financial vulnerabilities. I watched an influential hedge fund manager, standing just 3 feet away, adjust his glasses and squint at the scrolling red numbers. His face went completely slack. He immediately reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket and retrieved his smartphone, typing furiously to instruct his brokers to dump any remaining Wilson Corporation stock before the market opened on Monday. The information spread through the massive room with the terrifying speed of a viral contagion. It did not require a loud announcement. It moved through frantic whispers and meaningful glances. One woman covered her mouth with a manicured hand and leaned into her husband's ear. The husband then tapped the shoulder of the city councilman standing next to him. Within a span of 60 seconds, the entire congregation of 150 elite guests understood that they were currently attending a lavish celebration funded entirely by a bankrupt and highly toxic entity. The magnificent floral arrangements and the cascading champagne fountains suddenly transformed from symbols of prestige into glaring evidence of gross financial negligence and impending federal investigations. The reaction of high society to sudden poverty is a fascinating behavioral study. There is no dramatic screaming or sudden panic. Instead, there is a synchronized and perfectly polite choreography of abandonment. I sat in my chair and watched the physical manifestation of my mother's greatest nightmare unfold in real time. The dense crowd of people that had previously pressed so tightly around the stage, eagerly trying to bask in the glow of the Wilson family name, began to subtly shift. A prominent real estate developer who had just been laughing at my mother's cruel joke took a deliberate step backward. His wife followed suit smoothly, turning her body slightly away from the center of the room. Another couple shifted their weight and drifted toward the perimeter of the ballroom. It was a slow, methodical, and entirely silent retreat. They were creating a literal vacuum around my mother and my brother. They were treating them as if they had suddenly contracted a highly infectious and completely incurable disease. In the ruthless ecosystem of the Connecticut Elite Association with financial failure was the ultimate social poison. These guests had attended this wedding to network with power and secure future favors. Now that the power was revealed to be a catastrophic liability, they needed to sever all visible ties immediately. No one wanted to be photographed standing next to a man who was about to be indicted for embezzling employee pension funds. No one wanted to be associated with a family whose entire existence was a fraudulent scheme. Beatrice felt the shift in the room before she fully saw it. Her highly attuned social radar picked up on the sudden drop in temperature. She looked away from the damning numbers on my tablet and turned back to her audience. The triumphant smile she had worn all evening tried to resurface, but it failed completely. She reached out her hand toward a woman she had considered a close friend and confidant for over 20 years. Cynthia. Beatrice called out, her voice tight and unnaturally high. "Cynthia, please tell them this is ridiculous. We have our weekly charity luncheon on Tuesday." Cynthia, a woman dripping in authentic diamonds, stopped moving. She did not walk toward my mother. She did not offer a comforting smile. She simply looked at Beatrice with a mixture of profound pity and absolute detachment. "I am sorry, Beatrice," Cynthia said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "I just remembered that I have a scheduling conflict on Tuesday. In fact, my calendar is quite full for the foreseeable future." Cynthia then turned her back completely and walked toward the coat check. That single polite rejection was the final blow that shattered my mother's fragile reality. Beatrice stood entirely alone in a rapidly expanding circle of empty space. The people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, the people she had sacrificed my childhood and my dignity to appease, were now actively fleeing her presence. She desperately tried to catch another person's eye. She looked toward the politicians, the bankers, the socialites who had praised her just an hour ago. Every single person averted their gaze. They looked at the ceiling, they looked at their phones, they looked anywhere but at the desperate woman standing in the center of the ruins. The social isolation my mother feared more than death itself had finally arrived. She was no longer the queen of her artificial empire. She was a pariah. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking incredibly small and fragile in her expensive silver gown. Her entire identity was tied to the validation of the people currently turning their backs on her. Without their approval, she was absolutely nothing. I sat at table 24 and observed her devastation without a single ounce of sympathy. She had created this prison of superficial judgments, and now she was locked inside it. I had spent 33 years being treated like a ghost in my own family, while she chased the applause of strangers. It was profoundly poetic to watch those exact strangers strip away her worth in a matter of minutes. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of a funeral. The elite guests were mourning the sudden and violent death of the Wilson family legacy. And as the reality of their complete social and financial destruction settled heavily over the room, the final remnants of my brother's manufactured confidence completely and violently snapped into a million tiny little broken pieces. The sudden rejection from the people Evan had spent his adult life trying to impress acted as the final catalyst for his mental collapse. He had spent months balancing the crumbling ledgers while projecting an aura of wealth. Now that illusion was entirely obliterated, and his fragile ego could not process the overwhelming weight of his public humiliation. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, breaking the stifling silence of the ballroom. It was a noise born of pure, unadulterated panic and explosive rage. He turned away from the retreating crowd of wealthy elites and locked his frantic, bloodshot eyes entirely on me. His face morphed from a mask of pale terror into a twisted portrait of furious indignation. The charming, charismatic groom vanished without a single trace. In his place stood a cornered and desperate man who was watching his universe burn to ashes. Evan lunged forward. He abandoned his new bride at the head table and stormed down the center aisle with heavy, aggressive strides. The few guests who had lingered nearby quickly scrambled out of his path, seeking safety behind the towering floral arrangements. His tailored tuxedo jacket flared open as he marched, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. He did not care about the optics of his behavior anymore. The carefully constructed social etiquette that dictated his every move had been completely abandoned. He was operating on pure primal fury. He closed the distance between the center of the room and my table in a matter of seconds. He did not slow down as he approached the swinging kitchen doors. He threw his entire body weight forward and violently slammed both of his hands onto the pristine white linen tablecloth of table 24. The impact was incredibly forceful. The crystal water goblets rattled dangerously against the expensive china plates, and a heavy silver fork clattered loudly onto the marble floor. The sudden sharp noise caused my mother to flinch violently in the background, but I did not move a single muscle. Evan leaned across the small circular table, invading my personal space. His face was inches from mine, radiating a sickening heat. Sweat poured down his forehead, and the veins in his neck bulged ominously against his tight collar. "You ruined everything," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of rage and absolute despair. "You have always been a vindictive monster, Clara. You could not stand to see me happy. You could not stand to see me succeed where you failed, so you had to come here and destroy my entire life." His breath smelled heavily of expensive champagne and bitter panic. He was completely detached from reality. He genuinely believed that my presentation of the factual financial documents was an act of unprovoked sabotage rather than a necessary corporate reckoning. "You think you are so smart sitting there with your little encrypted hard drive," he spat out, glaring at the tablet resting near my hands. "You think exposing the corporate debt makes you powerful. You are nothing but a pathetic, bitter woman trying to tear down the empire I sacrificed my blood and sweat to build. You have single-handedly ruined my wedding day and destroyed our family name." I maintained my perfect composure. I looked directly into his frantic, bloodshot eyes and offered absolutely no emotional response. My profound silence only served to infuriate him further. The two massive security guards standing just a few feet away shifted their weight, preparing to intervene and physically remove my brother from my presence. I raised my hand slightly, issuing a silent command for them to remain perfectly still. I wanted Evan to keep talking. I needed him to dig his own grave so deeply that he could never possibly climb out. My lack of fear seemed to push him over the absolute edge of human rationality. He was so accustomed to intimidating me into submission during our childhood that my current defiance shattered his remaining self-control. He struck the table again, causing the remaining water in the crystal goblets to spill over the edges and stain the crisp white linen. "You have no idea what it takes to run a massive conglomerate," he screamed at the top of his lungs, abandoning his hushed tone entirely. His voice echoed violently across the cavernous ballroom, ensuring that every single remaining guest could hear his desperate tirade. "You sit in your little office judging me, but you do not understand the immense pressure I was under. I was keeping this family afloat. I was protecting our legacy." He waved his arms wildly, gesturing toward the extravagant decorations surrounding us. "Do you know how much this level of prestige costs to maintain? Do you know what it takes to project strength when the market is turning against you?" He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving with every ragged breath. His desperation to justify his monumental failures completely overrode his basic survival instincts. He forgot about the investors watching him. He forgot about the tech billionaire standing silently in the room. He forgot about the brilliant corporate attorney he had just married who was listening to every word he spoke. "I just needed a little more time," Evan roared, his voice cracking under the immense strain. "I had a massive commercial expansion deal lined up for the third quarter. It was going to save the entire company and make us completely whole again. I just needed one more month to finalize the paperwork and secure the external funding. I only used the employee pension fund to pay for the wedding and Jada's ring." The confession ripped through the ballroom like a physical shockwave. Evan froze, the horrifying realization of what he had just admitted finally crashing down upon his fractured mind. The wealthy guests stared at him in absolute revulsion. Stealing from hardworking employees to fund a party crossed into undeniable criminality. He had just handed federal prosecutors a perfectly recorded criminal confession. The words hung suspended in the chilled air of the ballroom. Jada stopped breathing. She stood perfectly still at the head table, her posture rigid as the horrifying magnitude of his confession washed over her. As a top-tier corporate attorney, she spent her days prosecuting financial crimes and dismantling fraudulent executives. Now she realized with sickening clarity that she had just legally bound herself to one. Her dark eyes slowly drifted downward, tracking along the exquisite lace of her designer wedding gown until they landed on her left hand. She stared at the massive 4-carat diamond ring resting heavily on her finger. Evan had presented that ring to her during a highly publicized proposal, boasting about its flawless clarity and historic value. He had spun a beautiful tale about custom sourcing the stone from a private dealer in Antwerp to ensure it was worthy of her brilliance. For months, she had worn it as a symbol of their shared future and mutual success. Now that glittering stone felt like a physical weight chaining her to a massive federal crime. She was wearing stolen employee pension funds on her hand. I watched her brilliant mind race to calculate the legal fallout. The immediate threat to her pristine reputation was catastrophic. If the Bar Association or her partners believed she had any prior knowledge of this embezzlement, her entire career would be instantly destroyed. She looked up at Evan, her expression transforming from shock into a cold, terrifying disgust. I decided it was the perfect moment to deliver the final piece of evidence. I smoothly unzipped the inner compartment of my structured clutch. From the dark silk lining, I retrieved a single folded sheet of thick ivory paper. I stood up from my chair and bypassed my trembling brother entirely. I walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the head table where Jada remained frozen. The guests watched in breathless silence as I closed the distance between us. I stopped just a few feet away from the bride and held out the folded document. "Jada," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and professional. "You are an exceptional lawyer, and I know you rely entirely on documented facts, rather than emotional promises. You are currently calculating your exposure to his admission regarding the stolen pension funds used to purchase your engagement ring. But you are missing one crucial piece of the financial puzzle." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out to accept the paper. Her manicured fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. She immediately recognized the official letterhead of the most prestigious gemological laboratory in the city. I did not wait for her to read the entire page. I delivered the truth directly. That is the authentic appraisal I had commissioned during my acquisition audits of Evan personal liabilities, I explained clearly. That massive 4-carat stone on your finger is not a flawless diamond from Antwerp. It is a high-quality lab-grown fake. Its actual market value is less than $2,000. Jada gasped, her gaze snapping from the paper to the glittering rock on her hand. Evan let out a panicked, strangled noise behind me, but I did not turn around to acknowledge his desperate presence. If the ring is a cheap fabrication, Jada asked, her voice dangerously low and lethal, where did the stolen pension money actually go? I smiled a sad, knowing smile. That is the most pathetic part of his entire operation, I replied. My brother did not steal millions from hardworking employees just to buy you a beautiful piece of jewelry. He stole that money to cover his catastrophic offshore gambling debts. He has been funneling corporate assets through shell companies in the Cayman Islands for over a year to hide his massive losses from underground sports betting syndicates. He bought you a cheap fake ring to maintain the illusion of wealth while desperately trying to keep his creditors from breaking his legs. The revelation struck Jada like a physical blow to the chest. The man she thought was a visionary leader was nothing more than a degenerate gambler who had used her impeccable social standing as a shield. He had orchestrated this lavish wedding surrounded by her influential colleagues and powerful friends entirely on the dime of innocent workers whose retirements were now completely wiped out. Her entire relationship, the romantic dinners, the grand promises, the vows they had exchanged just hours ago, were constructed on a foundation of absolute deceit. Jada slowly lowered the appraisal document to the table. She turned her head to look at Evan, who was now weeping openly, tears streaming down his flushed, sweating face. He took a pathetic, staggering step toward her, his hands outstretched in a begging motion. "Jada, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking pitifully. "I was going to win it all back. I had a sure thing. I love you. I just needed to keep up appearances until the expansion deal closed." "Do not take another step toward me," Jada commanded. Her voice did not shake. It was a weapon forged in the fires of absolute betrayal. She was no longer a bride navigating a stressful social event. She was a woman who had just realized she was sharing a room with a dangerous liability. She looked at Evan with a level of revulsion so pure it seemed to lower the temperature in the massive ballroom. "You stole the life savings of innocent people to fund your pathetic gambling addiction. You lied to me every single day we were together. You used my reputation to legitimize your fraudulent existence." Evan dropped to his knees on the marble floor, completely abandoning his pride. He buried his face in his hands, his sobs echoing loudly in the quiet space. Jada did not offer him a single ounce of pity. She systematically reached for her left hand and gripped the glittering fake stone. The ultimate symbol of their union was shattered. Jada pulled the fake diamond ring from her finger with a sharp, deliberate motion. The metal scraped against her skin, but she did not flinch. She dropped the worthless piece of jewelry directly into Evan's half-empty champagne glass. It sank to the bottom with a pathetic little clink. She turned her back on him completely, severing the remaining ties of their fraudulent marriage. The guests watched her walk away with absolute respect, recognizing a woman who knew exactly how to cut her losses and survive. Evan remained on his knees, sobbing into his hands, an utterly defeated man. The ballroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence once again. The dramatic dismantling of my brother was complete, but the evening was far from over. I stood by the head table, smoothing the fabric of my simple navy dress, preparing to address the remaining financial logistics of the foreclosure. Before I could speak, a new sound shifted the gravity of the room. It was the steady, measured rhythm of Alexander Thorne stepping forward. The tech billionaire had remained perfectly silent and completely motionless throughout the entire confrontation. He had watched the spectacular implosion of the Wilson family legacy with the detached observation of a predator studying a localized extinction event. Now he finally decided to break his silence. Everyone turned to look at him. The wealthy investors and the panicked socialites held their collective breath, anticipating his reaction. They expected him to express profound disgust at the criminal behavior he had just witnessed. They expected him to summon his massive security detail and storm out of the tainted venue, preserving his pristine corporate reputation. They expected him to act like a savior, distancing himself from the wreckage of my family's shattered empire. He did absolutely none of those things. Alexander did not puff out his chest or project an aura of arrogant superiority. He did not look at my weeping brother on the floor or my mother who was still trembling on the stage. He walked with a calm, purposeful stride directly toward me. He stopped exactly 3 feet away, maintaining a respectful professional distance. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and then performed an action that completely defied every single established rule of high society etiquette. Alexander Thorne, the elusive tech billionaire who notoriously made global politicians wait for his phone calls, deliberately lowered his head. He bent his waist and executed a slight but undeniable bow of absolute submission. It was not a gesture of romantic chivalry. It was a formal corporate acknowledgement of total surrender. He was publicly bending the knee to a superior financial force. CEO Wilson. Alexander announced, his deep, resonant voice echoing loudly across the stunned ballroom. I have waited outside in my vehicle for 3 hours. Will you finally let me sign the merger? I will accept your terms. The collective gasp that erupted from the 150 elite guests was so violent, it seemed to rattle the crystal chandeliers above our heads. The sheer magnitude of his statement hit the room like a seismic shockwave. Alexander Thorne was not here to save my family. He was not here to invest in Evan's pathetic commercial expansion. He was here to beg me for a business deal. And he had just publicly admitted that I held the absolute upper hand in the negotiation. My mother Beatrice let out a strangled wheezing sound from the stage. She gripped the edge of a floral pedestal to keep herself from collapsing. Her reality was fracturing beyond repair. The man she had worshipped, the billionaire she had relentlessly pursued for 2 years to rescue her sinking company, was currently bowing to her discarded daughter. He was referring to me by my corporate title, validating my immense power, and publicly yielding to my demands. The very foundation of her elitist worldview was turning to dust beneath her expensive designer heels. I looked down at Alexander, who maintained his respectful posture, waiting for my response. This merger had been the culmination of a grueling 8-month negotiation. His technology firm possessed an innovative artificial intelligence infrastructure, but they lacked the necessary capital to scale globally. Aegis Capital had the resources to fund his expansion, but I demanded a controlling 51% stake in the resulting conglomerate. Alexander had fought my terms tooth and nail, deploying his best lawyers and financial analysts to counter my aggressive acquisition strategy. We had reached a bitter stalemate just 2 weeks ago. He thought I would eventually compromise to secure his technology. He severely underestimated my patience and my absolute willingness to walk away. You kept me waiting in the cold for a very long time, Clara, he added, his tone shifting slightly from formal submission to a quiet, desperate plea. I recognized that I overplayed my hand during the final round of our negotiations. Your valuation of my company was entirely accurate, and your restructuring plan is ruthless, but undeniably brilliant. I concede the battle. You have won. I will sign over the controlling interest to Aegis Capital exactly as you originally stipulated. Please tell me the offer is still on the table. The elite investors in the crowd began whispering frantically to each other. They were witnessing a historic transfer of corporate power happening right in the middle of a ruined wedding reception. They now understood that my firm Aegis Capital was not just a successful hedge fund. We were a financial leviathan capable of swallowing a tech titan like Alexander Thorne. The same people who had mocked my simple dress and my supposed lack of a career were now staring at me with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror. They realized that a single phone call from me could likely bankrupt half the room. I let the billionaire wait for his answer for a few agonizing seconds. I enjoyed his total submission and the terrified silence of the audience. I retrieved a sleek silver pen from my clutch. I held the sleek silver pen, letting the cold metal ground me in reality. The silence in the ballroom stretched so tight it felt as though the air might shatter. From my peripheral vision, I watched my mother Beatrice struggling to draw oxygen into her lungs. She was visibly hyperventilating on the elevated stage, her chest heaving beneath her custom silver gown. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of a floral pedestal so hard her knuckles were drained of color. The man she worshipped as a financial deity was currently bowing before the daughter she had just publicly humiliated. The severe cognitive dissonance was completely breaking her. She had spent the last 33 years meticulously curating a narrative where I was the ultimate family failure. She needed me to be a disappointment so her golden child Evan could shine brighter by comparison. Now that entire fictional universe was violently imploding right in front of her eyes. The billionaire she viewed as the pinnacle of success had just addressed me by a corporate title commanding absolute respect. He publicly admitted I held the power to dictate the terms of his massive expansion. Beatrice let out a shallow, ragged gasp. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching the faces of the wealthy investors and prominent politicians she had invited. She was looking for anyone to validate her crumbling worldview. She found absolutely nothing but horrified stares and judgmental whispers. The elite guests were looking at her as if she were a madwoman who had just unknowingly insulted the most powerful financial entity in the room. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords seemed completely paralyzed. She managed only a weak, trembling sound that barely carried over the space. Alexander did not miss the pathetic noise. He slowly straightened his posture, rising from his respectful bow. He turned his head and locked his sharp, calculating eyes directly onto my mother. The expression on his face was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look of a man who had just scraped something utterly foul off the bottom of his polished shoe, but now his professional restraint completely evaporated. "You called her pathetic." Alexander projected his deep, resonant voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and cutting through the stifling tension of the ballroom. "You stood on that stage and demanded these people pray for her because she did not meet your shallow, meaningless standards of success. You paraded your fraudulent son around as a visionary leader while mocking the only person in your family who possesses true brilliance." Beatrice recoiled as if physically struck by his words. She raised a trembling hand to her throat, her mouth opening and closing in a silent, desperate plea for him to stop. He took a deliberate step toward the stage to ensure his next words carried maximum impact. "You are completely blind to the reality of the world you pretend to rule," he continued, his tone laced with absolute venom. "The woman you forced to sit by the kitchen doors, like a common servant, did not just purchase your family debt. She just acquired my entire technology firm for $2.4 billion in a completely hostile corporate takeover. She outmaneuvered my best lawyers, dismantled my defensive financial strategies, and forced me to accept a merger giving her absolute controlling interest." The staggering financial figure hit the room like a physical shockwave. $2.4 billion. The wealthy guests gasped aloud, the sheer magnitude of the transaction momentarily overriding their polite social conditioning. They stared at me with newfound terror and profound respect. The pathetic spinster in the navy dress was actually an apex predator who moved markets and swallowed global technology companies whole. Alexander turned slightly, gesturing toward me with a sweep of his hand. His eyes never left my mother's terrified face. "Your daughter is the most terrifyingly brilliant woman on Wall Street," he declared, his voice ringing with undeniable certainty. "She commands a financial empire that could buy and sell your entire existence before lunchtime. She operates with a level of strategic genius that I have rarely encountered in my entire career. And you treated her like garbage because she refused to participate in your pathetic little social charade." Beatrice finally collapsed. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she sank onto the polished wooden floor of the stage. The heavy layers of her silver gown pooled around her like a puddle of liquid metal. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. It was not a performance. It was not a calculated manipulation designed to elicit sympathy. It was the genuine, absolute breakdown of a woman who had just lost everything she valued. Her social standing was completely eradicated. Her wealthy friends had abandoned her. Her golden child was a confirmed criminal facing federal prosecution. And the daughter she had relentlessly abused and discarded was now the most powerful person in the room. The absolute poetic justice of the moment was almost overwhelming. She had tried to bury me in the dark so she could shine in the spotlight. But she had failed to realize that I had spent all those years in the darkness learning exactly how to control the light. I stood silently watching her weep on the wooden stage. I felt absolutely no pity for the woman who had caused me so much pain. I felt absolutely no urge to rush forward and offer her comfort. I simply observed her total destruction with the cold analytical detachment of a chief executive officer auditing a bankrupt company. The reckoning was entirely her own creation. She had built the guillotine, she had sharpened the blade, and now she was finally facing the inevitable consequences of her own cruel actions. The massive ballroom remained completely silent for a very long time, allowing the sound of her pathetic weeping to echo as a permanent testament to her ultimate failure. That heavy, unbroken silence was eventually shattered by the distinct mechanical sound of heavy rubber wheels rolling across the polished marble floor. The grand mahogany doors at the back of the reception hall swung open for the second time this evening. My executive assistant Henry walked through the entrance. He did not wear a tuxedo. He wore a sharp charcoal business suit, projecting the cold efficiency of a corporate auditor entering a crime scene. He was pushing a large metal utility cart, heavily laden with thick black binders and bound financial ledgers. The guests parted for him just as quickly as they had parted for Alexander Thorne. They watched the cart roll down the center aisle, their eyes fixed on the stacks of paper that represented the physical manifestation of my brother and his undeniable guilt. Henry stopped the cart directly beside my small table. He offered me a brief, respectful nod before stepping back and folding his hands behind his back. I turned my attention away from my weeping mother on the stage and looked at the terrified groom trembling on the floor. Evan had managed to pull himself up into a kneeling position, but he lacked the strength to stand. His tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with his own panicked sweat. I reached over and picked up the thickest black ledger from the top of the cart. It was incredibly heavy, containing thousands of pages of irrefutable financial data. I let it drop onto the table with a loud, resounding thud that made my brother flinch violently. "We have spent enough time dealing with theatrical emotional outbursts," I announced to the room. My voice was steady and devoid of any sympathy. "It is time to deal with the cold, hard facts. As corporate professionals, many of you in this room understand that numbers tell the absolute truth. They do not care about family legacies or social standing. They only reveal what has actually been done." I opened the heavy cover of the ledger and slowly turned to the first tabbed section. I did not need a microphone. The acoustics of the ballroom and the absolute silence of the crowd carried my words perfectly. 50 years. I began looking directly at the prominent investors and business leaders who had previously supported my family. That is exactly how long my grandfather and my father worked to build the Wilson Corporation. It took 5 decades of careful negotiations, strategic development, and conservative financial planning to construct a real estate empire with a sterling reputation. I turned the page, letting the crisp sound of the paper punctuate my sentence. It took Evan exactly 18 months to drive that 50-year legacy directly into the ground. Evan let out a miserable whining sound from the floor, but I ignored him entirely. "Let us review the executive expenditures for the third quarter." I continued tracing my finger down a column of printed numbers. While the commercial real estate market was experiencing a significant downturn, my brother decided the company desperately needed a brand new luxury yacht. He authorized a corporate transfer of $4.2 million to a private shipyard in Italy. He categorized this purchase as a necessary marketing expense for entertaining high-value international clients. I looked up and met the eyes of a local politician standing nearby. According to the maritime logs, that vessel has never once been used for a single corporate event. It was exclusively utilized for his private weekend parties in the Caribbean. A wave of disgusted murmurs rippled through the crowd. I turned another page. Furthermore, I read aloud, raising my voice just enough to cut through the whispers. He approved an executive bonus structure that borders on absolute insanity. In the same month that Wilson Corporation failed to meet its primary loan obligations, Evan paid over $600,000 in exclusive country club initiation fees and premium membership dues for himself and his closest friends. He spent corporate capital on private helicopter charters to golf tournaments across the country. He funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts to cover his catastrophic gambling losses, all while fabricating revenue reports to pacify the board of directors. I closed the first ledger and picked up a thinner red folder from the cart. This contained the most damning evidence of all. I opened it and looked down at Evan, who was now weeping openly again. But the yachts and the golf tournaments are not the most disgusting part of this financial autopsy, I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. You see, while my brother was drinking vintage champagne on a boat bought with company money, the foundation of the corporation was crumbling. For the past 3 months, over 400 dedicated construction workers, administrative staff, and low-level managers have not received their scheduled paychecks. The guests gasped. Stealing from wealthy investors was a massive scandal, but stealing wages from blue-collar workers was a moral failing that repulsed even the most cynical billionaires in the room. He froze the payroll accounts and deliberately delayed the compensation of the people actually doing the heavy lifting, I explained. He told them it was a temporary banking error. He promised them their money was safe. Meanwhile, he was actively draining the employee pension fund to ensure this ridiculous wedding reception could proceed without interruption. The money that was supposed to guarantee the retirement of loyal workers who spent their entire lives building this company is currently paying for the caviar you just ate and the crystal glasses you are holding. I tossed the red folder onto the table. The heavy stack of papers spilled out across the pristine linen, displaying the exact bank transfer routing numbers that proved every single word I had just spoken to be undeniable reality. Evan let out a final devastated sob. He reached out a violently trembling hand toward my shoes, a completely and utterly broken and ruined man. The horrifying reality of the unpaid workers and the massive stolen pension funds hung over the ballroom like a thick, dense, toxic cloud. The elite guest stepped further away from the disgraced groom, wanting absolutely no association with his devastating financial crimes. Nobody looked at Evan with any pity. They looked at him with the kind of absolute revulsion reserved for the lowest forms of white-collar criminals. Nobody understood the severe legal implications of his actions better than the woman standing at the head table. Jada had listened to every single word I had spoken. She had watched the physical evidence spill across the white linen tablecloth. As a brilliant corporate attorney, she did not need to see the bottom line of every single ledger to know the pathetic man sobbing on the cold marble floor was definitely headed straight for federal prison. Jada slowly lowered her hands to her sides. She took a deep, calming breath and smoothed the expensive fabric of her designer wedding gown. I watched the profound transformation taking place behind her dark, intelligent eyes. She was actively compartmentalizing the emotional shock of the betrayal and replacing it with pure, unadulterated survival instinct. She had fought relentlessly to build a pristine legal reputation in a fiercely competitive industry. She knew that any lingering association with a man who embezzled employee retirement funds would instantly terminate her career. She made her decision with the swift, ruthless precision of a seasoned litigator, cutting a massive liability loose before it could drag her under the water. Jada stepped away from the head table. Her movements were sharp and deliberate. She walked toward the spot where Evan was currently sobbing on the polished marble floor. He looked up at her through his tears, extending a trembling hand in a desperate plea for comfort or solidarity. Jada did not reach out to comfort him. She looked down at him with a gaze so incredibly cold, it could have frozen a raging river. She raised her left hand and deliberately pinched the massive 4-carat stone between her right thumb and index finger. The ring that was supposed to symbolize their eternal union, and his supposed vast wealth, was nothing but a cheap synthetic lie funded by the stolen futures of innocent workers. With a smooth, forceful motion, Jada pulled the fake diamond ring off her finger. She did not throw it at him in a fit of passionate rage. She acted with absolute calculated disdain. She turned slightly toward the table where Evan had left his half-empty crystal champagne flute. She extended her hand over the glass and simply opened her fingers. The heavy piece of worthless metal and synthetic stone dropped directly into the expensive vintage champagne. It hit the bottom of the crystal flute with a sharp, definitive clink that echoed perfectly in the suffocating silence of the massive ballroom. The tiny bubbles immediately swarmed around the fake diamond, highlighting the absolute absurdity of his entire fraudulent existence. Evan let out a miserable wailing sound. "Jada, please," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "I can explain everything. I can fix this. You cannot abandon me right now." Jada did not blink. "There is nothing left to explain, Evan," she stated, her voice echoing with lethal professional authority. "You are a common thief who used my reputation as a shield for your catastrophic financial crimes. You lied to me about your assets, your company, and this ridiculous ring. You are a disgusting liability, and I am completely done with you." She turned her back on him, completely severing the fraudulent bond they had forged just hours prior. She left him weeping into his hands, a pathetic puddle of ruined ambition. Jada did not walk toward the exit. She did not flee the room in tears like a humiliated bride. Instead, she adjusted her posture, holding her head high, and walked directly toward my table. She bypassed the shocked guests and whispering socialites with absolute confidence. She stopped right in front of me, standing shoulder to shoulder with the tech billionaire Alexander Thorne and my executive assistant Henry. She looked at the heavy black ledgers and the red folder resting on the table. Then she lifted her dark, intelligent eyes and met my gaze directly. There was no animosity left in her expression. There was only the profound mutual respect of one powerful woman recognizing the undeniable supremacy of another. "CEO Wilson," Jada announced, her voice clear and commanding, ensuring that every single remaining guest in the ballroom could hear her declaration. "As of this exact minute, I am officially filing for an expedited annulment. I want absolutely nothing to do with that man or this highly toxic family ever again." She paused for a fraction of a second, allowing her formal separation from the Wilson legacy to firmly settle over the crowd. Then she tilted her head slightly, a brilliant tactical maneuver already forming in her sharp legal mind. "Tell me, CEO Wilson, do you currently require external legal counsel for the upcoming asset seizure? Because I happen to know exactly where he hides his offshore account routing numbers, and I am highly motivated to assist Aegis Capital in dismantling his remaining infrastructure." I looked at the fierce, gorgeous woman standing before me in her ruined wedding dress, offering to help me legally destroy the man she had just married. I could not help it. A wide, genuine smile spread across my face. Game recognizes game. She was a survivor, a predator in her own right who knew exactly how to navigate the bloodiest corporate waters. I reached across the table and extended my hand toward her. "Jada," I said, my voice carrying a tone of absolute professional admiration, "I would be absolutely delighted to retain your exceptional legal services. We have a massive amount of corporate restructuring to accomplish by Monday morning, and your insider knowledge will be incredibly valuable to my firm in this specific transition." Jada reached across the table and firmly grasped my extended hand. Her grip was strong and resolute, signaling the official commencement of our formidable new partnership. She gave a single definitive nod before stepping back to stand beside my executive assistant, Henry. They instantly formed a unified front of corporate efficiency, standing ready to execute the rapid liquidation of the Wilson family assets. I turned my attention back to the tech billionaire who had patiently awaited the conclusion of this highly productive legal recruitment. Alexander Thorne watched the exchange with profound respect, mirroring the sentiment I felt toward my new corporate counsel. He understood assembling a team of ruthless survivors was the key to maintaining market dominance. Now it was time to formalize the monumental agreement that had brought him to this tragic gathering. I stepped out from behind the cramped confines of Table 24. The space was simply too small to accommodate the execution of a $2.4 billion corporate merger. I gestured toward the lavishly decorated head table positioned prominently at the front of the ballroom. The banquet table was draped in silver silk and adorned with cascading white orchids that had cost my brother a small fortune in stolen funds. It was the perfect stage for the final act of this financial conquest. Alexander nodded in agreement and matched my stride as we walked together down the center aisle. The remaining wealthy guests scrambled out of our way, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid obstructing our path. We reached the head table where Evan had arrogantly planned to toast his fabricated success. I did not hesitate. I reached out and grabbed the base of the massive floral centerpiece that dominated the middle of the table. With a swift, effortless motion, I shoved the extravagant arrangement of white orchids and imported roses aside. The crystal vase scraped harshly against the polished wood underneath the silk, sending delicate white petals fluttering down onto the marble floor. Alexander unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket and reached into the interior pocket. He produced a thick stack of legal documents bound in dark leather. These were the finalized merger contracts detailing the complete acquisition of his technology firm by Aegis Capital under my controlling terms. He placed the portfolio directly onto the space I had just cleared. He smoothed the top page and produced an expensive fountain pen, offering it to me first. The symbolic gesture of yielding the first signature was not lost on the silent spectators. It was the ultimate demonstration of his total submission to my corporate authority. I took the pen, feeling the cool, heavy metal against my fingers. I looked down at the complex legal jargon that officially cemented my status as the most powerful financial force in the room. Before the tip of the pen could even touch the crisp white paper, a guttural scream tore through the ballroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. Evan had managed to scramble up from the floor where Jada had discarded him. The sight of me preparing to sign a multi-billion-dollar acquisition on the very table, meant for his wedding reception, completely snapped his fragile grip on reality. He was witnessing his pathetic existence being entirely overwritten by my monumental success. He charged toward the head table with blind, furious desperation. His arms flailed wildly as he sprinted, his eyes locked onto the leather-bound contracts resting between us. He intended to tear the documents to shreds, hoping to somehow halt the momentum of my ascending empire and reclaim a fraction of his lost dominance. "Stop him!" Evan shrieked, a string of profanities flying from his lips as he lunged forward. "You cannot do this to me, Clara. I will not let you take everything." He was mere feet away, his hands reaching out like a desperate drowning man, trying to pull me down into the abyss with him. I did not flinch or step back. I simply watched as the inevitable consequence of his foolish action unfolded. The two massive security guards who stood near the kitchen doors moved with terrifying velocity. They closed the distance before Evan could even touch the edge of the silver silk tablecloth. The guard on the left intercepted my brother mid-stride, grabbing his tailored tuxedo jacket and spinning him around with brutal efficiency. The second guard swept his legs out from under him. The impact was swift and absolute. Evan crashed heavily onto the polished marble floor directly in front of the head table. The guards moved in perfect synchronization, immediately pinning his arms behind his back and driving a heavy knee into his spine to immobilize him completely. My brother let out a sharp cry of pain and humiliation as his face was pressed firmly against the cold, hard stone. He squirmed and thrashed against their iron grip, but he was entirely powerless. He was completely emasculated in front of the wealthy investors and elite politicians he had spent his entire life trying to impress. They watched him writhe on the floor like a captured criminal stripped of all his manufactured dignity and hollow prestige. He was nothing but a pathetic fraud pinned to the ground while the real titans of industry conducted their business above him. I looked down at my brother, offering him absolutely no sympathy. I turned my attention back to the finalized merger documents. I leaned over the large table and applied the pen to the paper, signing my name with bold, sweeping strokes. The ink flowed smoothly, securing the acquisition of the technology firm and expanding the reach of Aegis Capital beyond measure. I handed the pen back to Alexander. He stepped forward and quickly added his own signature next to mine, officially transferring the controlling interest of his life work into my capable hands. The multi-billion-dollar transaction was executed flawlessly over the ruined remnants of the Wilson family legacy. The ultimate victory was finally mine. The ultimate victory was finally mine. The heavy leather portfolio containing the signed merger agreements rested securely beneath my fingertips. Alexander Thorne stepped back from the table, giving me a nod of profound professional respect, before signaling his security team. The two massive guards maintained their brutal hold on my brother, keeping Evan pinned firmly against the cold marble floor. His muffled sobs of total defeat provided a pathetic soundtrack to the historic financial transaction that had just concluded. I slowly lifted my gaze from the documents and surveyed the ballroom. The wealthy guests who had previously cheered for my downfall were now completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of my corporate execution. They watched me with wide, terrified eyes, understanding that I now controlled every single asset tied to the Wilson family name. But the most spectacular transformation was occurring on the elevated stage. My mother Beatrice had watched the entire sequence of events unfold with a look of absolute vacant horror. She had seen her golden child tackled and humiliated in front of the most powerful people in the state. She had watched the billionaire she worshipped formally surrender his technology empire to the daughter she had deemed entirely worthless. The heavy, thick fog of her lifelong delusion was finally lifting, and the brutal reality of her new existence was crashing down upon her with the force of a collapsing building. Beatrice looked out at the sea of elite faces, the politicians, the socialites, the hedge fund managers she had spent decades meticulously courting. She saw the profound revulsion in their eyes. She saw the prominent real estate developer whispering to his wife as they both took another deliberate step toward the exit. She saw her closest confidant, Cynthia, actively avoiding her gaze. In that terrifying span of seconds, my mother realized the absolute totality of her ruin. The foreclosure notice was not a clerical error. The debt was entirely real. Aegis Capital owned the magnificent Hamptons estate she was currently standing inside. We owned the cars in her driveway, the artwork on her walls, and the very bed she slept in. Her limitless credit cards were already declining. Her prestigious country club memberships would be permanently revoked by morning when the embezzlement scandal hit the financial news networks. She was entirely penniless, and she was a complete social pariah. The sheer terror of becoming invisible to high society completely broke whatever fragile pride she had left. Beatrice let out a ragged, gasping sob that echoed horribly through the silent ballroom. She gathered the heavy silver fabric of her custom designer gown in her trembling hands and began to descend the wooden steps of the stage. Her movements were completely devoid of her usual practiced elegance. She stumbled, her expensive heels catching on the hem of her dress, making her look incredibly clumsy and desperate. She pushed past a group of shocked investors who instinctively recoiled from her as if her sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. She moved erratically down the center aisle, completely ignoring Evan, who was still weeping on the floor under the weight of the security guards. Her eyes were locked entirely on me. She reached the head table where I stood, flanked by my executive assistant Henry and my formidable new legal counsel Jada. Beatrice did not stop at a respectful distance. She closed the final few feet between us, and then performed an action that completely defied everything I knew about the proud, arrogant woman who had raised me. My mother let her legs give out beneath her. She collapsed downward, her knees hitting the hard, polished marble floor with a sickening thud. The expensive silver silk of her gown pooled around her in a messy, chaotic heap. She reached out with both hands, her manicured fingers frantically grasping at the hem of my simple navy blue dress. She tilted her head upward, exposing her tear-stained face and her ruined makeup to the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers. "Clara," she wept, her voice cracking with a sickening, desperate sweetness that made my stomach churn. "My darling, my beautiful, brilliant girl, please, you have to listen to me." I did not step back. I did not pull my dress out of her frantic grip. I simply stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had taken the microphone just an hour ago to publicly demand prayers for my pathetic existence. The contrast between her previous arrogant cruelty and her current pathetic submission was absolutely staggering. "You have proven your point, Clara," she sobbed, clutching the fabric of my dress tighter. "You have shown everyone how incredibly smart and successful you are. I am so unbelievably proud of you, my darling. I always knew you had this extraordinary fire inside you. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. I was just trying to push you to reach your ultimate potential. Please, you have to believe me." The blatant historical revisionism was almost fascinating to witness. She was actively attempting to rewrite 33 years of systematic emotional abuse into a narrative of tough maternal love. She thought she could manipulate me with the very same false affection she had always reserved exclusively for Evan. "Please, Clara," she begged, the tears streaming freely down her face, cutting deep tracks through her expensive foundation. "You cannot take the house. You cannot take the Hamptons estate. Where will I go? How will I entertain my friends? You cannot cancel the country club memberships. My entire life is built around those charitable committees and those social luncheons. I will be completely ruined. I will have absolutely nothing left." She was not begging for her family. She was not asking for mercy for Evan, who was facing decades in federal prison. She was not apologizing for the stolen employee pension funds. She was begging for her social status. She was pleading on her hands and knees to desperately keep her luxurious facade intact. I stared down at the pathetic display unfolding at my feet. The woman who had birthed me, the woman who had spent more than 3 decades ensuring I felt entirely worthless, was now clutching the hem of my dress like a desperate beggar. A few feet away, my brother remained pinned to the cold marble floor by the massive security guards. His muffled sobs echoed pitifully through the cavernous ballroom. There were no tears welling in my eyes. I felt no urge to scream or unleash decades of suppressed rage. The burning anger that had fueled my grueling ascent to the top of the financial world had long since calcified into pure, unadulterated ice. I did not need to raise my voice to execute my final corporate maneuver. I simply stood there, a monument of absolute composure, observing the total destruction of the Wilson family empire. I slowly reached down and firmly detached my mother from the fabric of my simple navy blue dress. I did not shove her away, nor did I offer a hand to help her stand. I merely removed her grip, severing the last physical connection between us. She gasped, her hands falling uselessly to her sides as she remained kneeling on the floor. Her tear-stained face tilted upward, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The maternal manipulation that had always served as her primary weapon was completely ineffective against me. "I do not do charity for fraudsters," I stated. My voice was incredibly calm, carrying the smooth, lethal authority of a chief executive officer rendering a final verdict. The words sliced through the heavy silence of the ballroom, extinguishing the last tiny ember of hope flickering in my mother. Aegis Capital is a highly disciplined financial institution. We do not subsidize the lavish lifestyles of individuals who embezzle from their own employees. Your country club memberships, your luxury vehicles, and this magnificent beachfront estate are no longer yours to claim. They are corporate assets, and they will be liquidated immediately to satisfy the massive debts your golden child incurred." Beatrice let out a devastated wail, collapsing forward until her forehead nearly touched the polished marble floor. The reality of her impending poverty finally crushed her spirit completely. I turned my attention away from my ruined mother and focused on my brother. Evan was still struggling weakly against the relentless pressure of the security guards. His expensive tailored tuxedo was ruined, stained with spilled champagne and his own panicked sweat. He turned his head sideways, pressing his cheek against the cold stone, and looked up at me with an expression of sheer terror. He was waiting for a reprieve, a familial pardon that would magically erase his catastrophic crimes. "Evan," I began, ensuring my diction was perfectly clear for the entire room to hear. You genuinely believed you could steal the retirement funds of hundreds of loyal, hard-working employees to finance your ridiculous gambling debts and this absurd wedding reception. You assumed your fraudulent accounting would remain hidden beneath the prestige of our family name. You thought you were the smartest person in every room you entered. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to where he lay pinned on the ground. Henry. My executive assistant stepped forward and handed me a thick, sealed manila envelope. I held it up, letting the bright light from the crystal chandeliers reflect off the stark white paper. But you were incredibly careless, Evan, I continued. You left a massive digital trail of offshore transfers and fabricated revenue reports. You truly thought no one would ever audit the private ledgers of the Wilson Corporation. But Aegis Capital conducts exceptionally thorough due diligence before executing any hostile takeover. We found every single hidden account. We traced every stolen dollar back to the Cayman Islands. We documented the exact timeline of your systematic embezzlement. Evan let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. His eyes darted toward his former bride, Jada, who stood nearby with her arms crossed, watching his demise with absolute cold professional detachment. She offered him no sympathy, only the chilling glare of a top-tier corporate attorney witnessing a criminal facing his inevitable ruin. I lowered the envelope and delivered the decisive blow. This envelope contains the delivery confirmations for the digital ledgers I just presented to this room. Exactly 2 hours ago, my legal team transmitted the complete, unredacted financial records of the Wilson Corporation to the regional directors of the Securities and Exchange Commission. A secondary encrypted file was simultaneously delivered directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The elite guests remaining in the ballroom gasped in unison. The mention of federal authorities solidified the absolute finality of his destruction. He was not just facing bankruptcy, he was facing catastrophic criminal prosecution. The wealthy investors who had previously praised his business acumen now looked at him with profound, undisguised disgust. You are no longer a chief executive. Evan, I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying finality. You are a confirmed felon. The authorities are currently reviewing the evidence of your massive fraud. They have already frozen your remaining personal accounts and flagged your passport to prevent any international flight. The warrants for your arrest are likely being drafted at this very moment. Your reign of arrogant cruelty is permanently over. Evan squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his flushed face as he sobbed uncontrollably into the marble floor. He had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more fake wealth to project. He was completely and utterly destroyed. I looked down at his trembling form one last time. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction settling within my chest. The years of enduring his patronizing insults and enduring my mother and her relentless emotional abuse were finally avenged. The scales of justice had been perfectly balanced through ruthless corporate efficiency. I suggest you enjoy the wedding cake, Evan, I said. Prison food is much worse. I turned away from my brother, leaving him to choke on his own despair. My gaze drifted back down to the woman still kneeling on the marble floor. Beatrice had stopped begging aloud. She was merely trembling now, her expensive silver gown absorbing the spilled water and champagne from the ruined table above. She looked up at me with hollow, terrified eyes. She had witnessed the absolute clinical execution of her golden child, and she finally understood that I possessed zero mercy for anyone who bore the Wilson name. The maternal mask she had desperately tried to put back on was gone, completely washed away by the sheer magnitude of her impending ruin. She opened her mouth, her lips parting, as if she might try to summon one last command, one final attempt to assert her dominance as my mother. But no sound emerged. The absolute certainty of her destruction had stolen her voice. I looked at her, taking in the smeared makeup, the disheveled hair, and the trembling hands. For 33 years, this woman had dictated my self-worth. She had constructed a narrative where I was the ultimate failure, a burden she graciously tolerated for the sake of appearances. She had weaponized my independence, transforming it into a tragic flaw to be pitied by her country club friends. I stepped closer to her, ensuring that my physical proximity emphasized the permanence of our new dynamic. I did not kneel to meet her at her level. I forced her to strain her neck and look up at the daughter she had so eagerly discarded. "You stood on that stage just an hour ago," I said, my voice echoing smoothly across the silenced ballroom. "You took a microphone and you proudly invited 150 people to pity me. You called me a spinster. You called my life a waste. You looked out at this crowd, and you told them that my existence was pathetic." Beatrice flinched at the word as if it carried a physical weight. The guests surrounding us shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on the spectacle of the fallen matriarch. I let the silence stretch, allowing the memory of her cruel toast to fully resonate within the minds of everyone present. "You want to know what pathetic actually is, Beatrice?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper that carried effortlessly through the room. "It is not being 33 years old and single. It is not building a life quietly without the need for constant public validation. It is being 60 years old, completely bankrupt, and selling your own child's dignity for the applause of strangers who are currently laughing at you." I gestured broadly to the perimeter of the ballroom where her former friends and social allies were huddled together. "I want you to look at them, Beatrice. Look at the people you sacrificed my childhood to impress. They are not looking at you with admiration anymore. They are looking at you with profound disgust. They are watching a desperate, penniless woman who raised a criminal and destroyed her own family just to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth. They are calculating exactly how quickly they can erase your phone number from their contacts. They will spend the next 10 years dining out on the story of your spectacular public downfall. You sold your soul to a society that is going to forget your name by tomorrow morning." My mother turned her head slowly, following my gesture. She looked at the faces of the elite women she had gossiped with, the powerful men she had courted for investments. Every single person averted their eyes. Some looked at the floor while others turned their backs completely. The social isolation she feared above all else was no longer a threat, it was her permanent reality. A low, wounded moan escaped her throat. She wrapped her arms around her waist, rocking back and forth on the hard stone floor. She was a queen stripped of her kingdom, an emperor with no clothes, forced to stand naked before the very people she sought to rule. "You spent your entire life chasing a ghost," I continued, my voice relentless and steady. "You built a fortress out of paper money and stolen pensions, and you locked me outside because you thought I would ruin the aesthetic. But the storm came anyway, Beatrice. And the fortress collapsed because it had absolutely no foundation. You thought Evan was your savior because he wore expensive suits and lied with a charismatic smile. You thought he was building an empire while he was actually digging your grave. And you threw me into the dirt because I refused to hand you a shovel. Well, the digging is over now, the bottom has fallen out. You have no money left to hide behind and no status left to protect. You are finally forced to simply be yourself. And looking at you now, kneeling in the ruins of a stolen wedding reception, I can confidently say that the person you actually are is the most tragic thing I have ever witnessed." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The absolute undeniable truth of my words was the final nail in the coffin of her ego. Beatrice Wilson was completely dead to the world of the elite. She would wake up tomorrow morning with no assets, no credit, and no friends. She would face the brutal reality of an ordinary, struggling existence without a single shred of the resilience required to survive it. I looked down at her one last time, cementing the image of her defeat in my memory. I felt an incredible sense of lightness spreading through my chest. The heavy, suffocating chains of her expectations had been permanently severed. I was no longer the disappointing daughter. I was the architect of my own destiny and the executioner of her fraudulent legacy. My business here is officially forever concluded. My business here is forever concluded. I turned my back on the pathetic scene on the cold marble floor. I did not spare a single glance at my mother crumpled in her ruined gown, or at my brother weeping under the heavy restraint of the security team. I walked with measured steps back to the cramped space near the kitchen doors, where this reckoning had begun. Table 24 was exactly as I left it. The crisp white linen was slightly stained, but my simple structured clutch rested undisturbed next to the empty crystal glass. I reached down and picked up my purse, tucking it neatly under my arm. The modest accessory contained no flashy designer logos or ostentatious jewels. It was practical and efficient, perfectly matching the woman who carried it. As I straightened my posture, a tall shadow fell across the polished floor. Alexander Thorne stood silently waiting for me to finish gathering my belongings. The tech billionaire did not step forward to aggressively claim my attention. He did not swoop in like a traditional savior attempting to rescue a distressed damsel from a family dispute. He knew I needed no rescue. He had just witnessed me orchestrate the complete financial annihilation of a corporate dynasty without raising my voice or shedding a tear. He approached me as an absolute equal, a peer in the highest echelons of the ruthless financial world. He recognized the terrifying magnitude of my power and respected the flawless execution of my hostile takeover. Alexander smoothly adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit jacket and extended his right arm toward me. It was a silent invitation, a gesture of profound professional admiration and genuine partnership. I looked up into his sharp, intelligent eyes and saw the quiet acknowledgement of my victory reflecting back at me. I smiled a warm, genuine smile that finally reached my eyes. I reached out and rested my hand lightly upon his forearm, feeling the solid, reassuring strength of an ally who understood the exact cost of building an empire from nothing. Together we turned and faced the massive expanse of the grand ballroom. Our departure commenced with a slow, synchronized stride. As we moved away from the kitchen doors and headed toward the main entrance, the suffocating atmosphere of the room shifted dynamically. The 150 elite guests who had spent the evening laughing at my expense and worshipping my fraudulent brother immediately reacted to our approach. They did not just step aside, they actively scrambled to clear our path. The wealthy investors, the prominent politicians, and the ruthless socialites parted like the Red Sea parting for a divine mandate. They pressed their expensive tailored suits and custom designer gowns flat against the heavily decorated walls, desperate to avoid obstructing our exit. They lowered their heads and averted their eyes, completely terrified of drawing my attention. The silence accompanying our walk was absolute and profound. The only sound in the cavernous space was the steady rhythmic tapping of our shoes against the marble floor, echoing like the steady ticking of a clock. As we passed the ruined head table, I glanced sideways and made brief eye contact with Jada. The brilliant corporate attorney stood tall and composed her fake engagement ring, long abandoned, at the bottom of a champagne flute. She offered me a single slow nod of profound respect. I returned the gesture, acknowledging the fierce survivor who had smartly chosen to align herself with the winning side. My executive assistant, Henry, followed closely behind us, pushing the heavy metal utility cart carrying the black financial ledgers that held the undeniable proof of my brother and his monumental crimes. We reached the heavy mahogany double doors at the front of the ballroom, just as a new sound pierced the silence of the estate. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance, echoing across the private beachfront property. Within seconds, the noise multiplied and grew exponentially louder, transforming into the unmistakable, aggressive wail of approaching police sirens. The authorities had processed the unredacted financial ledgers and the digital evidence I had transmitted earlier. The federal agents and local law enforcement were arriving to officially execute the arrest warrants for massive corporate embezzlement and pension fraud. The harsh red and blue emergency lights began to pulse violently through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom. The flashing colors washed over the terrified faces of the elite guests and illuminated the horrific realization dawning on my brother. Evan let out one final desperate scream as the heavy boots of the police officers echoed in the grand foyer outside. I did not pause to watch him be dragged away in handcuffs. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped out of the stifling, toxic atmosphere of the wedding reception. Alexander and I walked out onto the expansive stone terrace. The cool evening breeze immediately swept over me, carrying the fresh, salty scent of the ocean and washing away the bitter smell of panic and expensive cologne that had choked the ballroom. The sun was beginning its final descent over the Hamptons, casting a vibrant display of deep oranges and purples across the sky. The warm golden light bathed the entire coastline in a breathtaking glow. I stood on the terrace and took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the sweet air of absolute freedom. I had walked into this estate as the pathetic outcast forced to sit in the shadows and endure public humiliation. I was walking out as the undisputed architect of my own destiny, leaving the toxic remnants of my family behind, to burn in the catastrophic fire they had built with their own deceitful hands. The heavy chains of their crushing expectations were permanently broken. I tightened my hold on Alexander and his arms stepping forward into the beautiful, welcoming warmth of the setting sun, completely ready to conquer whatever the world had to offer next.